the importance of vitamin D in terms of autoimmunity. And if your vitamin D levels are not sufficient, that's a big risk factor. Are your levels optimal for you based on your potential genetic variances?
That's an area that you need to pay attention to forever.
Yeah.
Because it is your genes. So some people drink alcohol within minutes, they'll flush, they'll sweat. That's toxicity in action, because they have a version of the gene that is inactive. So they might be able to mask it and put on a brave face, but actually inside them, it's still causing a massive amount of damage. When people are under pressure, the points that give way are always your genetic vulnerable points. They're the parts that are going to let you down. Knowing where your vulnerable points are means that you can be proactive and support them. People think, oh, eating organic, is it really worth it? If people know that they've got particular vulnerabilities in terms of detoxification of those chemicals, then it might persuade them to develop those habits for life.
Yeah.
I have experienced anxiety forever, so I actually break down B6 more quickly than most people. I basically don't make the anti-anxiety chemicals as efficiently. And so when I learned that, it was transformational.
Hello and welcome to the CNM Specialist Podcast with me, Bobby Qureshi. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Emma Beswick. Emma Beswick is a CNM-trained nutritional therapist and CEO of Lifecode GX, the leading Nutrigenomics testing company. Emma is extremely passionate about how our unique genetic blueprint can help to inform our choices around diet and lifestyle. Outside of her work with Lifecode GX, Emma frequently lectures and presents at conferences as a leading expert in the field. And in today's podcast, we'll be discussing the subject of nutrigenomics, what it is, and how genetic testing can help personalize your diet and lifestyle in order to optimize your health. We'll be looking at individual vitamin requirements, responses to foods and beverages, including dairy, caffeine, alcohol, and gluten, and we'll be answering the question why certain people respond differently to certain foods, environmental toxins, stress, and more. So Emma, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
And we're glad to have you here. Well, nutrigenomics is a cutting edge area of medicine. So I think what we really need to start with here in simple terms is just telling our listeners what nutrigenomics actually is.
So it's a combination of nutrition and genomics. So it's looking at how your genes interact with food, other environmental factors like sleep, stress, etc., and how unique that is to you. So we look at genetic code, which is your DNA, and your DNA is like the written instruction to your body about how it behaves and responds to different foods, for example. So an analogy is if the DNA code is the writing, it's the instruction manual, the way those genes express, so that's a term people might have heard, gene expression, is like the vocalization, it's like the speaking of those words. And the environment can either quieten that down or allow it to be louder. And so that's what gene expression is.
Makes sense. I know when I'm teaching nutrigenomics, I will often sort of explain this idea of the fact that the genes load the gun, if we think of the gun as an analogy, and the environment pulls the trigger. So kind of really emphasizing that we're kind of born with our genes. We can't change them, but what we can change is how they are activated, how, like you said, we kind of tune them up a bit or how we tune them down a bit. And I guess that's really what this is all about, understanding about how we can influence our genes to best optimize our health.
Absolutely. And I think the tuning analogy is a really nice one because it is about subtleties. So the gun analogy is quite interesting. It's very widely used, but I think that almost has a negative connotation. It's like your genes are a bad thing waiting to happen, when actually a lot of the time it's just about differences. Like, is one person got a strength in this area, another person might have a weakness. So it's much more like a sliding scale than an absolute black and white on or off. It's about nudging and tuning your own unique biology to be the best version of you.
That makes sense. So it's very naturopathic. It's all about individualizing this, personalizing this to kind of make those, I like the description of you kind of fine tuning the body, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is, like I said, it's very cutting edge. You're obviously doing extremely well with Lifecode in this area. I'm interested to hear though, how did you get into nutrigenomics?
So I was introduced to genetics really young at school. And at the time we did experiments on fruit flies. And that's still something that genetics involves. So research in genetics often uses these tiny little flies. And we looked at things like what colour their eyes are and how that is inherited. And then I had a massive gap and did loads of different things. And I worked in the corporate world, and my job was data analysis. And I then decided that I wanted to do something that I actually cared about, that was about making people feel well and making myself feel well too. And I went to CNM. I didn't know what I would get from that, apart from it was something that interested me. So I started the nutrition course, and the Nutrigenomics lecture was looming. I was super excited about it. And as a result of that, I thought, actually, this is something that I could use and work on that merges my previous skills and experience with my passion for nutrition and health and bring it all together. And so I went and did lots of tests and looked what was out there in terms of the marketplace, and realised there was a huge gap in doing this in a really naturopathic way. So, for example, medical genetics is a whole different ballgame, and that tends to look for things that are very pathological.
Okay. And when you say medical genetics, do you mean the sort that conventional medicine would do? Like if you went to the NHS, for example, right?
Exactly. So the NHS in the UK is leading edge globally when it comes to genetic testing, but they focus on things that are really rare. So, for example, there might be a young baby or child who isn't developing or thriving, and they want to work out what the problem is. Or there might be someone who's got cancer and they're trying to work out how to treat them.
Right, yeah.
So those are two areas. It's rare disease and cancers that are where the NHS tend to specialise, whereas we specialise in things that are more subtle, that may have fairly small effects, or collectively a set of genetic differences might have a big effect, but we can always do something about it through nutrition and lifestyle.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So in terms of your genetic testing, Emma, what sort of things are you testing for?
So we're looking for really quite common changes in DNA. So things that maybe up to 50 or even 60% of the population have.
Oh, wow.
Really common. The least frequent variance that we look at is 1%, which is still fairly common. Mm-hmm. So that's one criteria. And they are just single letter changes usually. Okay. There is an exception to that we'll be talking about. That's
great. And when you say single letter, so we're talking about the DNA sequence, right?
Yeah.
So just going back to that, just so all of our listeners are really following this kind of understanding visually. So we've got these genes that you've been talking about, which basically is like a recipe. It's like a code.
Yeah.
And so you've got like different letters, which are basically amino acids. So amino acids make up proteins. And so we've got them in a sequence, and the idea basically is that you're looking at variations from the normal. So what we expect to see, you're kind of looking at it and going, oh, that's a variation.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. And so if you do get a variation, just carry on there in terms of what the implications of that could be.
So some variations don't have any impact They don't even change the shape of the protein that is made. So this is the skill and the analytical aspects. You have to look for things that do make a difference. And we work on exclusively understanding how that difference affects.
Okay.
Because then if you know how and you know why, you can arrive at a solution to counteract that if that's what you're trying to achieve. But there are billions of letters, and we're examining maybe a couple of hundred because they're the ones that are well understood. So that's our focus.
Okay, this definitely makes a lot of sense. So just stripping it right back now for our listeners, if we think of DNA, if we just start from the very basics, just tell us sort of what DNA is, what's going on, etc.
So it's a string of letters that are arranged on chromosomes. So people might have heard of that. We've got 23 pairs of chromosomes, and they're just like the way the DNA is organised.
Yeah.
So there are these billions and billions of letters that we all have, and we inherit those letters from our parents. So when we are conceived, we randomly inherit different combinations, and that is with us for life.
Yeah.
So the code is fixed at that point. The variable is how that code interacts in our body. So we can't change the code, but we can change where that code sits and what's surrounding it and interacting with it.
And so those variants that you spoke about before, the changes that we can get, when do we develop those? When do they happen?
So they're with us right from zero. So we inherit most of them from one parent.
Okay.
And so they're called changes or variants because that's compared to a reference genome. So it's this concept really, because that person doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Everybody has millions of these changes, but there is this reference genome that is the perfect
the
human.
gold standard.
Yeah.
Be interested to see what that looks like.
Yeah, exactly. But most of these things have evolved for a reason. So the reason that we have variants is it's so the human race is resilient. Some variants are helpful to survival in different environments, and we can talk about some of those, like how it has helped humans to survive really harsh environments. So they're there for a reason. The things that we are looking at, usually there is a benefit as well as a downside.
Okay. And then according to that, you then recommend certain changes to optimize whatever's going on there. Yeah. I mean, the way I describe DNA in lectures anyway is imagining you've got this big recipe book, basically. And this recipe book is the same recipe book in every single cell in your body. So every cell, all the trillions of them have the exact same recipe book. And one page is a recipe, and that makes a protein. So a page is what we call a gene, right? So a gene is the code, it's the recipe. Sort of follow on from me there in terms of explaining how this is relevant in terms of this subject.
Yeah, so say you had a recipe for muffins.
Okay.
So the muffins could be different flavours, and depending on the page of the book, you might have a recipe for raspberry muffins or blueberry muffins or coffee muffins. And that's really the same as when you inherit DNA from your parents. If both of your parents are brown-haired, then actually you are going to have brown hair, because that's a dominant gene. Okay. So a dominant gene is something that overrides a weaker gene.
So it makes it happen, basically.
Yeah. So for example, ginger hair is something that you could have one parent with ginger hair, one parent with brown hair, but you're less likely to have a child with ginger hair.
Okay.
Because the ginger hair is a weaker.
It's not a dominant.
Yeah. It might more randomly happen. But most of the children, if you got a ginger-haired dad and a brown-haired mum, most of the children are going to have brown hair.
Yeah. Okay. If we think of an example, what's a really good example that you could think of that kind of just showcases exactly what this is all about from a practical perspective?
So in terms of nutrition,
Yeah, in terms of nutrition.
we could get onto a real example.
Yeah, let's do it.
So lactose is a milk sugar. So it's in dairy foods. And some people have a version of a gene that means that they can break down that sugar when they drink milk, and other people don't. So if you have the version of the gene that can, then you can digest milk and you can use that as a source of energy and other nutrients. If you have the less good version of that gene, your body doesn't make the enzymes or the proteins to break it down. And so if you drink milk, that protein, that sugar will just start to digest itself in your gut and make gas. And so you would get symptoms of lactose intolerance. So some people can and some people can't, but it's not like an allergy. It's not gonna cause a huge anaphylactic sort of response. It's just gonna kind of rumble away in your gut and create discomfort.
Interesting. How common is this?
It's actually more common globally to have the non-ability to digest lactose.
Wow. Do you think that's because maybe in how we've evolved in terms of, normally being breastfed for maybe up to a few years, and then because we're perhaps not intended to keep consuming dairy products or to keep consuming lactose, that then the body just genetically kind of, is that what it's all about?
It's exactly that.
Right.
So we all, or most of us, for this reason, can digest milk when we're born. So that is intended to give us that start in life, all the benefits of that. But then at the age of about 3, when people would typically be weaned, the body turns off that gene expression.
Right.
In most people, because it's as if, why do I want my resources to be spent on this when I don't need it anymore? I'm not having that breast milk anymore. So I'm going to use my resources and energy doing other things. So that is the default for the human race. But over many, many thousands of years, certain people existed in an environment where there were animal milk products. So we had goats, we had sheep, we might have had cows, and that became a ability to survive if those foods were available. So in an environment of scarce resource, when food was not available, the people who could digest sheep milk, goat milk, cow milk were those that passed on their genes.
Right.
And so the prevalence of that variant became more and more and more, but only in certain parts of the world.
So if you do have this lactose gene variant, how would this sort of potentially manifest as physical symptoms?
So it means that you can't actually digest the sugar in your gut. So that starts to ferment and create gas. And so you might feel bloated, you might have pain, you might feel a bit nauseous, but you might not connect it to the lactose. You might just think that's normal, or you might think it's something else. And in fact, we've had a situation where someone did a test, the test came back as lactose intolerant, and they didn't believe it was their result. When they had the consult with the nutritional therapist, they were convinced and they were able to explain how the symptoms connect to the gene. And then they were incredibly grateful.
Amazing.
So,
and what were her symptoms? What were the main? Was it what you just described? Basically?
Yeah, it was bloating, and she just hadn't made the connection at all. And kind of then when she was informed and put 2 and 2 together, the difference was absolutely astonishing. So it doesn't mean necessarily you can't have any lactose. It just means that there's a certain amount that can't be coped with. So mostly people can tolerate some cheese, especially harder cheese, because the lactose has already been digested.
Right.
But if they were to drink a latte, then that just might be too much and trigger that sort of response.
Amazing. Makes total sense. That's a great example as well about how this is relevant.
Yeah.
And a nice sort of straightforward recommendation as well. One of my favourite genes, actually, I must say, involves good old vitamin D. And I know this is quite a sort of well-spoken about gene. So would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about what this is all about?
So there are two genes that impact vitamin D. One is a receptor. So receptors are a type of gene that listen out for something. And a vitamin D receptor is listening out for vitamin D. And then when the vitamin D attaches to it, it creates a whole set of events that we would associate with what vitamin D does.
Yeah.
So bone health, mood, immunity, etc. And it does that by connecting with this gene.
So it's a bit like a key in a lock, basically. And
absolutely.
to open and to reap all the benefits, you've got to have the right lock.
Exactly. They've got to match.
Okay.
So if you have a variant on that gene, then maybe the lock's not quite the same shape and you can open it, but it's going to kind of stick and struggle a bit and not be as reliable. So those people need a more reliable supply of vitamin D, like a continuous amount, possibly a higher level. So when we think about vitamin D status, if you have a vitamin D functional test that tells you what your level is, then for some people their level needs to be more for that message to keep getting across. So that's an example of one size doesn't fit all.
Yeah.
Even in terms of if you go to a doctor or a therapist and they do a test for you, then you can interpret that result differently if you also understand how good you are at responding.
Right. Because I guess this is the thing. The blood test is looking at the key.
Yeah.
And I guess the genetics is looking at how the code is sort
Yeah.
of working and how well it's put together for the actual lock.
Exactly.
So just thinking in practical terms, let's just say you've got this variant, if we call it that, on the vitamin D receptor. So that gene, basically the recipe's wrong. So whatever we make is not quite right.
Yeah.
How could that potentially manifest as symptoms?
So any symptom of low vitamin D that you can think of, it's the same thing. It could result in the same consequences because it's just the vitamin D isn't getting through. That's the easiest ways to think of it. So people might have even something as extreme as rickets. And in fact, there's a really good example of a TV doctor whose son had rickets and he couldn't believe it. He's like, I'm a doctor and why has my son got this? We have a pretty healthy lifestyle.
Yeah.
But it turned out his son had these gene variants. And so what was a good enough amount for most people just was nowhere near enough for him to be healthy and develop optimally.
Wow. That's a great example. Is that Dr. Chatterjee?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought so. It's a great story. And actually, from my experience, rickets is far more common than we're led to believe. And I guess when you factor in, one, the fact that most people are vitamin D deficient anyway, and for various reasons, whether it be not enough sunlight, too much sunscreen, not enough source from the diet, etc. But then you've also got that other side, which really is only now just starting to be spoken about, whether the recipe, the gene is correct to make it becomes a whole other thing, and therefore we can't look at your blood test in isolation, I guess is the message here.
Exactly. And the sooner you know about this, the more proactive you can be about supporting it. So you could go all your life without realizing, and then in later life, you might have osteoporosis, for example, be more prone to that. Or you might realise that actually I've always tended to low mood, never got to the bottom of it. We had actually a business mentor working with us, lovely woman who had all her life had low mood, immune issues like allergy type issues, and she also had osteoporosis. She did our test because everyone who works with us does the tests, but it was her vitamin D receptor, and that was the connector to all of those different symptoms and experiences. So she was completely, amazed, and obviously wishes she'd known about it earlier.
Yeah, wow, amazing. I think I know vitamin D now gets a lot more attention than it has ever done, don't get me wrong, but still probably not enough. And I think it's such a fundamental. You mentioned there the immune system. Obviously, from the perspective of your immune system, it's so key. I often talk about it kind of as the ultimate immune modulator, right? It balances the immune system, helps it if it's a bit weak, but also if it's a bit excessive, like you said, maybe an allergy or an autoimmune disease where the body's attacking itself. Vitamin D can just sort of buffer that down and bring it back into balance. So if we think about it practically, if you've got somebody coming in with an autoimmune disease, I mean, we always talk about the importance of vitamin D, right, in terms of autoimmunity. And if your vitamin D levels are not sufficient, that's a big risk factor. Now we're adding on to it that it's not just about your levels, it's about, are your levels optimal for you based on your potential genetic variances?
Absolutely. And if you know that, then you know that that's an area that you need to pay attention to forever.
Yeah.
Because it is your genes. So it's not just a temporary situation. It's something that for you is worth that attention, is worth that investment if you're buying supplements, or it's worth working out what lifestyle changes are going to support you for life.
Yeah.
So that is, it's such a powerful thing to know about.
Agreed. And are there any other sort of key vitamins that are really good for testing in terms of the genetics?
So another vitamin is vitamin A. So for vitamin A, there are different forms of vitamin A. One you get from plants, so that's beta carotene. So think carrots, but also peppers and green vegetables. And the other you get from animal products, and that's retinol. And retinol has different functions than beta carotene. Now, there is a gene that converts the beta carotene to the retinol. So they're both called vitamin A, but they've got these different jobs to do. So if you have a variant on the BCO1 gene, beta carotene gene, basically, you cannot convert beta carotene to retinol as well. So you can do it, but it's as if the kind of capacity is much reduced. And so what that means is if you're not eating animal produce and you're depending on the plants and the carrots, then you might not be getting enough of that particular retinol, vitamin A. And that can impact all kinds of other things. Immunity as well, actually, is a huge one with that. And you probably wouldn't have any other way of knowing about it in terms of testing.
Of course. Okay. And so if we think of just going back to the beta carotene and the retinol, so they're both vitamin A, but beta carotene's like we could call it the precursor or the earlier form, and the retinol's kind of the fully formed vitamin A. So it's the beta carotene, like you said, has its own sort of functions. It's an antioxidant, so it kind of helps to prevent damage to cells, etc. But really what you need from the perspective of vitamin A, which like you said is kind of immune system and vision, you've got to convert it into retinol. But that conversion in some people is not particularly good. So if let's just say you're vegan, what does that mean for you?
It would mean that you are not getting the retinol directly from food because that's in animal produce.
So it's only in animal produce?
Yeah. So you're dependent on the ability to convert your beta carotene, carrots and other plants to retinol using this gene. So if you have the less active version of the gene, then it's probably not going to cut it, even if you eat loads and loads and loads of vegetables. So you want to know that. There's always a way around it. So We're not going to tell someone who is vegan that they can't be vegan. If they want to be vegan, then they can take a supplement, and there are ways of supporting them. But actually, some people do feel more healthy when they introduce some animal produce into their diet.
And I think that's the key thing. You're presenting this information to somebody and you're saying, look, whatever your kind of dietary preferences for whatever reason they might be, in your body, there is an issue creating active vitamin A. So basically, here are your options. You can supplement, you can consider adding in animal products into your diet, whatever really you're comfortable with. But there's a solution. And like you said, the thing with vitamin A, I actually feel like vitamin A doesn't get enough attention, right? We always talk about vitamin C and vitamin D, but vitamin A is this little forgotten vitamin that without it, our immune system struggles. Without it, we start to lose vision. So it's a really, really important one. And this is a great opportunity to kind of bring this up. So with this variant, this potential reduced capacity to make your active vitamin A, how often are we seeing this? How sort of prevalent is this particular variant?
It's about 40%.
Oh, wow. So it's a lot of people.
Yeah. You can actually have more than one variant on that gene as well. And so we actually look at 2 variances on that same gene. So we look at the combination. So someone might just have one alteration and someone might have the full works, the kind of maximum variation on that gene. So it's a sliding scale. Some people might be able to get away with it just about, and other people are definitely in need of that retinol.
Makes sense. And the other thing I just thought of actually just came to my mind as you were talking was that vitamin A, of course, is needed for your kind of membranes, for your structure. So if you think of your gut lining, your skin, it's quite important for sort of forming that barrier. So again, if we think of somebody that's got, say, leaky gut, skin barrier problems like eczema or something, then even there, it could just be that they think they're doing the right thing. They're eating what we're told to eat, which of course is a nice variety of color in our diet, but based on that person's genetics, it might not be quite optimal. So really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Another gene, which on the vitamin topic still, if we keep with that theme, is vitamin B9, or as people often refer to it, is folate. And I think in the Nutrigenomics world, if you know a little bit about Nutrigenomics, this is the gene I guess you may have heard of. So do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about this one?
So we need an active form of folate in our bodies. So if we don't have this folate, it means that our fertility might be compromised, our cardiovascular system might be compromised, our energy might be compromised, our neurotransmitters, our mood might be compromised. It has very, very, very far-reaching effects. So it's really, really important that we get enough intake, but also that we can activate it.
Right.
And so this gene MTHFR performs a final step in making methylated folate. And this is the most available to our cells and our systems. So
by saying active folate, we're basically saying the form that your body can use, right? And just to clarify, where do we get folate from in terms of our diet?
So it's mostly green leafy vegetables, but actually it's in orange juice and oranges, it's in beans. So it's quite common, it's quite easy to get if you're eating natural foods. But it's very, very common to have variances on several genes actually that are on the route to activating this.
Right.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And I always think with folate, think foliage, right? Yeah. So leaves, it's a great word to make you think of where it comes from.
Yeah.
So basically lots of greens and you should get folate. But if you have some potential genetic variances here, then you might have an issue. Even if you've got a diet rich with all leafy greens, you might have an issue with turning it into the form that the body can use.
Exactly.
Right? What's the difference between folic acid and folate?
So folic acid is a synthetic folate, so it's made in a lab, and the body was never designed to process that fake folate, if you will. It's become really, really prevalent because it's used to protect people who want to have a baby and make sure that baby develops properly. But actually it's cheap. So that's the main reason that folic acid is popular. Folic acid is right at the beginning of the process in terms of making the right active folate. So it has to go through loads and loads of steps. And so there are lots and lots of different genetic variances that can disrupt that process.
Right.
So some of it will get through, but sometimes people are prescribed really, really large amounts, and that can just jam up the system, basically. It's as if you're just putting something in the engine that it wasn't designed for.
It's like putting the wrong fuel in the tank, basically.
Yeah.
And how could that manifest if you were to have large amounts of folic acid? Could that present as physical symptoms?
It can actually result in similar symptoms to just not having enough folate in the first place, because it's literally like a spanner in the works. So you're kind of jamming up the system from doing what it's normally doing, and that can stop other folate getting through as well. And the other thing you need to activate this folate and make it workable is other B vitamins. So it's not just about one vitamin.
Right. So if you've got a genetic variant then on this, somewhere in this process, is that what your recommendation would be, to up your other B vitamins?
Yeah, so they're like the helpers. They're the cofactors. So they're helping these conversions happen. And with MTHFR, which is the big one,
the famous one.
the infamous one, that can have an impact where the conversion is up to 60 or 70% less effective, which is huge.
Yeah.
But actually, it's vitamin B2 that can stabilise that process. It's almost like you've got someone with a broken leg, and vitamin B2 is the crutch. It's really, really helping.
Sort of propping up the pathway,
Yeah. Whereas if you just give people more folate, then that's probably not going to be as effective. You've got to have the whole lot.
Right.
And that's why we often talk about B vitamins as a complex, isn't it?
Yeah, completely. So I guess really what would be good to highlight here would be the implications. If you've got something like that MTHFR variant, so basically your body's ability to create active folate is compromised, the implications of this I think is what's got the gene to be quite famous, because it's vast. And I mean, one of them, which you mentioned, would be fertility problems. So you might have somebody struggling to conceive, and little do they know they might be eating a diet rich in leafy greens, but their body's not able to activate enough of that folate. Another big one is, like you said, cardiovascular disease. So this is a big one, isn't it? Because you need that folate to stop or to lessen the production of something that could be harmful. I'll let you explain this one.
Yeah, so there's a chemical called homocysteine, which if it builds up, it basically damages your arteries. It's like a toxin. So it's just chipping away and causing damage all over the place. And normally that will be cycled around. And folate and B12, so this idea of all the B vitamins helping each other, are both really, really important for the homocysteine to be deactivated, if you will. So if it isn't, it can lead to cardiovascular disease, or other things as well. It's kind of like a chain of events that can impact toxic load, that can impact energy. Basically, it's just depleting your system. So as well as the homocysteine being too much, that homocysteine is supposed to be converted into things that are actually helpful. But it's just stuck, and it's just rattling around doing mischief,
causing problems.
And
homocysteine is also linked to things like Alzheimer's, right? So you know, when it's raised, it's linked to Alzheimer's. So we're even coming back to this idea that this genetic variant, if you've got it and if you're not being really careful, not only could you increase your risk of fertility problems, cardiovascular disease, which of course prevalence is through the roof, but also Alzheimer's, which of course is extremely common.
Yeah.
So this is, a big area to really nail down. And I guess this is why it's so popular. So if somebody has an issue with their sort of genes and they've got some of these variants, what would your recommendations be to kind of personalize it to them?
So depending where the variances are, you might want to give them methylated folate, which you can get as a supplement.
So this is the active form.
It's the active form.
Yeah.
However, when you eat natural foods, those foods already contain some of that active form.
Okay.
So they don't have to go through this process in the same way that folic acid has to. So I think nature has done a brilliant job at packaging these nutrients together. So a lot of the green leafy veg also includes other B vitamins, and it includes them in different forms. It's like a blend. So that is by far the best way. But if it's still not really getting through, or if you've got an increased need, say you're trying to get pregnant, or say you've got a family history of cardiovascular disease or Alzheimer's, then you could consider supplementing with the active forms.
Yeah. And I guess often on supplements it's written as methylfolate, right? METHYL. It's always a bit weird saying it out loud, isn't it? Okay, that makes perfect sense. So for a lot of people, this is something that, would perhaps resonate with them in some of the potential health issues. It's a really important one. I'm interested as well to talk a little bit about some of the beverages. I mean, we spoke a little about, of course, dairy products, but what about things like caffeine? Is this where some people can tolerate caffeine better than others? Is this the genetics coming in?
Absolutely. So there are similarities to vitamin D, but it's kind of the opposite. So with caffeine, there is a receptor, again, that interacts with the caffeine. And that can mean that it's super powered. So whereas the vitamin D was about the message not getting through, with the caffeine, it's about the message being really loud. And so for some people, they get a massively stimulating effect from a small amount of caffeine. And so it's as if the spike is bigger. But again, they might not realise, and they might not connect a jitteriness with the caffeine. Depends how aware you are. So, if you do these tests and you see these kinds of results, it can get you thinking and just be more self-aware.
Yeah. How common is that to have the gene where the caffeine gets amplified?
It's really common again. I think it's about 20%.
Okay.
I've got that.
I've got it too.
And I get really jittery. And I used to do daft things like, if I was presenting, I'd have loads and loads of caffeine before I presented. But actually, my adrenaline was already really high. Yeah. And so I'd go and present and I'd be quite shaky. And that's the last thing you want when you're presenting, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
It was kind of a weird sabotage thing going on. But it enabled me just to kind of, take stock and not do that anymore.
Yeah.
And then there's another dimension to caffeine as well, which is how long it lasts.
Okay, so that's interesting. Tell us a little bit about that.
So there's a gene that detoxifies the caffeine or deactivates it. And so you can have a slow version of that, which means that the caffeine effect lasts for hours and hours and hours, compared to someone who's got the fast version, which means the caffeine is whipped out more quickly. So if you've got the higher sensitivity and the slow removal, then that caffeine's going to have a bigger effect and it's going to be with you for longer.
Right.
And that's not necessarily bad.
Yeah.
It just depends what you want to achieve with the caffeine, doesn't it?
If you're trying to sleep and you're having a coffee at 6 p.m, probably not the best thing.
No.
I'm with you completely. I remember having a coffee, my last coffee, which was probably about 8 years ago now. And I remember having it before a lecture. And I don't even know why I had one. I very rarely would occasionally have had a decaf coffee before. And I had this coffee and I literally couldn't write on the board. And I remember, luckily, we had somebody doing an interview, and I sat at the back for the first part of the lecture, and I couldn't have taught. I was so jittery, my hands were shaking, and I thought, this is horrible. I was getting anxious, and luckily it kind of wore off a little bit. But yeah, it's not a particularly pleasant experience. So now, luckily I don't really have those problems, but I can see how it would really manifest. And I think the interesting thing about how some people break it down faster than others, because like I said, if maybe people think, oh, don't worry, I'll have a coffee at 3 p.m, but then they're maybe having problems getting to sleep, it's probably because, the caffeine's not being metabolized very well.
And people get very attached to caffeine because it does give them that lift. And often you'll know in clinic, if you suggest not having caffeine, they'll kind of fight you for it. But then again, understanding yourself can be the path to improving that situation and giving it a chance. Persuading people to try it.
I guess this is where, by doing, I like doing various different types of testing with certain patients of mine, and it does give you people like something hardcore, kind of, physical. You've got evidence, data, and I think to present that to somebody, they'll probably take it a bit more seriously than you just sort of going, you should really cut out coffee because it's not good for you. But if you've got something physical in evidence to show them, and
it's about you, so it's not that, oh, don't you just say that to everybody. It's about you. It's like, this is one thing that for you is potentially particularly problematic, so give it a try. And it's not something that I say to everyone. So I think that does make a huge difference for people.
I agree. What about alcohol? That's the next one.
So alcohol's really interesting. There is a gene that has a huge effect, which in detoxifying alcohol, there are 2 steps. And the first step, alcohol or ethanol, is made into something called acetaldehyde, which is really, really, really toxic, like hugely toxic. And then there is a second step, which is to detoxify that really, really potent middle ground. And the second step is more impactful. Now, certain populations, like East Asians, have a variant on that gene that it's really common in those populations. So, for example, you might be familiar with the Asian flush term. So some people drink alcohol and literally within minutes, they'll flush, they'll sweat. That's toxicity in action. So the alcohol's it's absorbed quickly, it's converted quickly, but then it's stuck as this middle toxic compound, because they have a version of the gene that is pretty much inactive. So they can't tolerate much at all.
And that's that second step?
It's the second step.
Right.
Yeah. And there are reports that in some of those cultures, because alcohol is becoming more of a thing and they're expected to be able to drink, actually that's incredibly detrimental. So they might kind of get over somehow feeling quite so bad, or be able to mask it and put on a brave face. But actually inside them, it's still causing a massive amount of damage.
Interesting.
And even for people with a good version of that gene, it takes a lot of helper nutrients to process that alcohol. So to help that gene work, it uses zinc, it uses magnesium, it uses B vitamins. So it's basically depleting and using up all those good nutrients to get rid of the toxin.
Right. So if that comes up, I mean, I guess the fairly obvious is to say to either avoid alcohol or reduce alcohol, limit it. Is that the basis, or do you go into kind of supporting those nutrients you just mentioned as well?
So usually if it's totally absent, then people would have some sort of an idea.
They would know already. You can't tolerate alcohol.
Yeah. And most people, you would expect them to have made a decision to not have much of it at all, or none. However, in people who maybe have the halfway, the sliding scale, so they've got a version of the gene that isn't the fastest, but it isn't the slowest, they might not realise, and they might not realise how damaging and depleting it is for them. So again, it's a little bit of a thought process. It's thought-provoking about that alcohol. But you can always look at genes and say, okay, I'm stuck with the gene, but what can I do to support it? So people do want to have a drink. For many people, it's hard for them socially to say, I'm never going to have a drink. So for them, at least knowing what the nutrients are that they need to replace is a good thing.
Right.
So it's an education as well.
Yeah. So you can say, look, you can have a drink, but you might want to take this multivitamin or this zinc or whatever it might be. Yeah. It's interesting you said about the Asian flush. I'm a quarter Indian, and definitely is me. If I have one drink of alcohol, my cheeks go bright red, and I just can't tolerate alcohol. So I'm great fun socially. I'm telling you, no caffeine, no alcohol, can't tolerate any of it. So coming back to this idea of different ethnicities, are there any other examples where we tend to find these different sort of variances in certain parts of the world?
So going back to the lactose, the ability to digest milk, sugar, is very, very much based on ethnicity. So, for example, in Northern Europe, most people of Northern European heritage can digest milk. Whereas if you go to India, it depends on the part of India. So in some parts of India, drinking milk and having cows as milk providers is part of the culture, but in other parts it isn't. So that's kind of geographic within a continent as well.
Interesting.
But even other things, quite often when you've asked about, so how frequent is this difference, it depends on the ethnicity, the population that you're looking at. So one example is there is a gene that helps to digest fat, and some people have a variant that means we can't actually pull the fats into our mitochondria to break it down for energy.
So the mitochondria are the little energy factories right in the cells.
Yeah. So when people talk about ketogenic diets, high fat diets versus carbohydrates, actually some people do not do well on a high fat diet because they can't actually move that fat into the right place to be broken down to make energy. And actually that variant is more common in European populations. It's still quite low frequency, so about 7% of people, not totally rare. So, 7 out of 100 people walking around have this variance. And so imagine there's loads and loads of publicity, the ketogenic diet, having high fat and low carb. It's really popular right now, but it might not work for everyone.
It's not a one size fits all.
Exactly.
It's a great example of it. It really is. It makes perfect sense. Thank you for sharing it, because it does make it a bit clearer as to, also the evolutionary kind of aspect to this.
Yeah.
It's interesting, really interesting for me as well. That's great. You spoke there a little bit about, obviously, how your body can, is it very good at kind of burning fats and getting the fat into the places to actually burn them? So that's interesting. Is there anything gene-wise relating to sugar that often goes wrong?
Yeah, so some people are much more vulnerable to developing insulin resistance if they eat more sugar.
Right. And just explain, if you could, what you mean by insulin resistance.
Yeah. So we need insulin, a hormone, to move sugar from the bloodstream into our cells. And that's where the sugar again is burnt or stored. But it shouldn't be whizzing around our bloodstream for too long or at too high levels, because again, it can cause damage to the arteries and something called glycation, which means it's like a caramelization.
Yeah, the sugar sticks together, becomes sticky.
It's a pretty horrible thought, isn't it? So we need this hormone insulin to move the sugar into the cells and out of our circulation. So you can have problems with that in two key ways. One, you might not make enough insulin in the first place. And that could be because your pancreas just isn't as good at doing that. And there is a gene that is involved in this. So people might not have done anything particularly wrong. They might have had a pretty healthy diet, but their ability to make insulin has never been quite as good as the people who had the good version of the gene. So they need to be a bit more careful.
So they're more susceptible to higher blood sugar levels.
Yeah. And those same people, if they're female, are more prone to developing diabetes when they're pregnant.
Right.
So it's related
so gestational.
Yeah. So it's useful to know that, I think. Just again, you could take extra care. And then there are autoimmune conditions that mean that your pancreas is damaged and it doesn't produce insulin as well, like type 1 diabetes. And there are genes that mean some people are much more at risk of developing that. So, for example, if you have a family where there is a parent who has type 1 diabetes, we've had a situation where they've wanted their baby to be tested to see if the baby has got that risk, because they want to do everything they can to prevent damage as early as possible. Whereas if you knew they were in the clear and they hadn't inherited this detrimental variance, then you could be more relaxed about how you feed and protect them.
It just helps to inform the choices that you make.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
Sorry, carry on.
And then there is a more kind of typical diabetes, the more common one, which is type 2 diabetes. And this is when we become resistant to insulin. And that is usually because we've kind of pushed it a little bit too far. So people have had a lot of sugar. The poor old cells are trying to respond to this sugar and let it in.
Yeah.
But when they get too full, they start to put their stops on and they don't respond to that insulin. And so that is type 2 diabetes ultimately. Now, there are some people who have a receptor, again, a gene that impacts that transfer of the sugar into the cells, and they are more at risk of developing that resistance. So again, it's good to know about this as early as you can, because it's going to persuade you to be more aware
vigilant.
of it. Yeah. Exactly.
Makes perfect sense. I often describe insulin a little bit like this whole insulin resistance, a bit like trying to get into a nightclub when you're underage. And I know it's a silly way of remembering this, but if you imagine sort of going to a nightclub once every couple of weeks, they might let you in if they know. But if you keep pushing it and every night you're going, they're like, okay, no, you're really taking the mick here. And that's kind of what happens. The cell's like, I just can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
It makes perfect sense what you're saying about how if that receptor has the variant, so maybe that, again, that lock in the door is a bit faulty or a bit bent or something's not right to allow it to open, then you're more likely to, if your diet's high in sugar, you're not going to be able to push the sugar into the cell. So sugar's building up in the blood higher and higher.
Yeah.
And then, like you said, we get all those damaging effects. So it is, again, an example of, I guess, how we would then individualize. I mean, of course, we're always trying to promote reducing sugar, but just being a bit more mindful of that, even more mindful.
Yeah.
What about in that case? I mean, for example, we often talk about how if you're dealing with insulin resistance, so you're trying to get that sort of channel open, get the bouncer to let you in, we might use something like chromium, the mineral chromium, which we find in various vegetables.
Yeah.
Is that something that you would recommend in this sort of case, just to really try and do everything you can to get that receptor working? Is that how it works?
Yeah, there are certain things that help that receptor. So again, it's not a black and white, it's not a done deal, it's not inevitable that you are going to develop insulin resistance. So you can do things like olive oil oleic acid, which is about 70% of olive oil is oleic acid, actually helps that receptor to retain its sensitivity and give it its edge, even if you have the variant. And there are lots of other things that can interact with it in a positive way. but not sugar.
Yeah.
So that's the big message. You know, it's like develop habits that aren't oriented around those sugars.
Yeah.
For that person, it's more important. It's not just a general health message.
Right. And how, I mean, is this something that we see often, this particular variant?
It's quite often. And you kind of think, well, why? Like, why would that variance be prevalent if it's so bad? And the fact is that it's only become so bad in the context of a world where there is so much sugar.
Yeah.
And there is a principle or theory that actually that was meant to protect ourselves anyway from getting too much sugar flooding in at times when it would happen less frequently. So all these things have a reason for being there. It's perhaps more that in certain conditions, whether it is cultures or whether it is in a modern world with lots and lots of processed food and more sugar, it happens to be a more dangerous version of the gene.
Really interesting. Amazing. Thank you so much for explaining that. Makes perfect sense. So we've spoken now a few times about genetic testing. Could you just explain a little bit about what the testing actually involves?
So it's really, really simple. It's a cheek swab. So we are collecting cheek cells, and from those cheek cells we can extract the DNA and produce the information. So it's really, really non-invasive. You don't need a blood draw. It's also really, really forgiving in terms of you can put it in the post. Doesn't matter if it takes a week to arrive, it's very, very stable. So we do get quite a lot of parents and clinics testing young babies and children, and we can do that. It's a question of however young or old you are, there is still a benefit to doing it. The only thing we do is if we know that it's a young child, then we'll provide extra swabs. So, you know, if it's a little bit tricky to get the cheek cells,
Sure.
then they've got a few attempts there to do it.
Amazing. So easy and no blood, which I'm sure a lot of people will be happy with.
Yeah, well, I'm really happy with it for sure.
I am interested. I mean, genetic testing has had a lot of press over the last few years. Some of it as well, not always positive. Sometimes it does get negative press and people concerned about various different things. What are your thoughts about the potential downsides, and is there much truth in all of that?
So I think that you should always have a health professional supporting you, even if you're just looking at something like lactose, for example, because people mistake the information and they interpret it slightly wrongly. And that might mean they're being overzealous about omitting a certain food group, or they've just read it wrong, you know? So we, as a company, actually insist on there being support available to people. It doesn't necessarily have to be loads, but it's just to make sure that that interpretation is correct and they're getting the most from it. And so that's a really important point. The other thing is that people understand what they are getting into before they do it. So there are some genes that we test for, although they're not in the medical kind of end of the spectrum, like we talked about NHS and cancer and things like that, they're still SNPs that people have heard about that could have quite a big impact or have a risk associated with them. So like Alzheimer's, for example, there is a gene called ApoE that confers quite a high risk of late onset Alzheimer's. Now you can imagine that that could be quite scary for people to find out they've got this risk. So we want to make sure that people know ahead of time that they are testing for this and they're doing it from an informed choice perspective. They're aware of what they might find out. And so we have a separate test for that because we don't want to just bundle it in with some things that are perhaps more innocent. And then we've got education of health professionals to make sure those health professionals know how to support clients when they get those results, and they know how to talk to them about it, and for them not to be terrified, you know. So I think that is super, super important. And then I think another aspect is privacy. And I think this is huge, and people absolutely should be concerned about what is happening to their very, very personal data. It's as personal as it could get. And so some companies do use data for research. They might sell it, they might share it. They're not always transparent about that. And so we don't do any of that. Basically, when you test with us, it's purely for the purpose that you sign up for, just for the report. The report is only shared with you and your health professional. So we wouldn't use that information in any other way. So it's not going to go somewhere that might end up with an insurance company, for example.
Right.
So I think that is something that more people are aware of.
I think so. Yeah, it makes sense. And I actually think one of the things that I've found, especially with other companies that tend to test more for kind of risk of certain diseases, that could be quite dangerous in the wrong hands, couldn't it? You know, if you quite harmlessly think, oh, I'm just going to do this panel, when suddenly you find out you're at a significant risk of Alzheimer's or something else, that could be quite scary in the wrong hands. And like you said, you've got this spectrum as well. Some of those variants might give you a high risk, some might be a very low risk, but still, to somebody that doesn't understand and needs somebody to explain it to them, of course, it could be not such a good thing. And I guess as well, this is where we come back to this idea of how does the environment interact with our genes? What are we doing to sort of nurture and support the healthiest environment? How can we bathe our genes in the healthiest environment possible? And I think these are, you know, crucial things, that even just the fundamentals, right? Eating well, living well, and then we can fine tune based on these little variants to ensure that we are living the best version of us, right?
Absolutely.
And just quickly, one thing, a few moments ago, you mentioned something called a SNP, and I was just going to ask you what we mean by a SNP.
So that's a single letter change, basically. It's the smallest alteration you can have in your genome. So that's what we've been talking about all along when we've said variants.
Makes sense. So it's the same thing basically as a variant, right? Yeah. I sometimes, when I'm explaining this in a lecture, or variants generally, I might say it's a bit like having, you know, a recipe to make a cake, and it's like, you know, there's 3 eggs there, but that SNP or that variant could change it to 300 eggs. So what you produce is not quite right. And like you said, it could go from 3 eggs to 4 eggs. It could go down to 2 eggs. It could go from 3 to 0. It could go up to 1,000. It is all, I guess that's when you're looking at that kind of variation, that spectrum. Okay, it's really interesting. And I wanted to ask you as well about detoxification. I know this is a big area in nutrigenomics. Of course, it's a hot topic. What's the link here? Are there any kind of really key genes that you would focus on in terms of detoxification?
Yeah, so detoxification was one of the first areas that was really well understood, and partly because people were looking at it from a medication perspective. So it was like, why is this medication causing a lot of side effects in this person but not in that person? So there was a lot of research into it, but it applies to so many things. So it could be exhaust fumes, it could be heavy metals. All of these things get absorbed, and then different people are able to neutralize and then eliminate them to different extents, or more or less efficiently. And there is a big gene involved in this called glutathione S-transferase. So it basically uses the master antioxidant glutathione as its helper to stick to all these toxins and eliminate them from the body. So this gene is extra interesting because instead of just having a SNP, the little letter change, some people have got the whole gene missing.
Wow.
So sounds quite dramatic.
Yeah. So if you've got a missing glutathione gene, what does that mean for you? Does that mean you can't produce any?
It means, again, you're not as good at doing this. So it could mean that, one person lives on the same street as another person. There's a ton of traffic going by every day, and one person actually gets really ill from those exhaust fume kind of exposure, and other people don't. But again, you can do something to support people with this missing gene, and that is more glutathione, because actually that's one gene out of a family of genes. So we've often got a backup plan. The body's not got that many places where there's only one way of doing it. So with the glutathione gene, there are a whole family.
Right.
And I kind of think of it as, if one of the family members has gone AWOL, then the other family members have got more weight to pull. The job is kind of distributed amongst them. So they need a little bit more help and a little bit more reward to perform that function and make up for the missing one. So that's more glutathione.
Right.
So master antioxidant, we can make glutathione, as you know, from sulfur foods. So things like broccoli.
Yeah.
And we associate broccoli as being this brilliant food for helping with detox, don't we?
Yeah.
Detoxification. And one of the reasons is it helps us make more glutathione, and that's more important for people who don't have that gene.
Interesting. I remember having a patient, this was actually one of my first exposures to Nutrigenomics properly in clinic, and it was a lady who had a missing glutathione gene. And she was a lady in her mid-40s, and she had something called Hashimoto's, which is an underactive thyroid. And it was really interesting. I'd seen a couple of people before, wasn't really getting anywhere. And when she came in to see me, one of the things I picked up on straight away was that she'd had some mercury fillings, and they were removed conventionally. And we know that if you're going to remove mercury fillings, you have to be extremely careful, because very easily the mercury can spill out into the mouth and then into the blood, and it becomes a problem. So anyone listening, if you are going to get mercury fillings removed, which maybe isn't a bad idea, do it with a really good kind of ecological dentist, who's somebody who very much is holistic. But anyway, in her case, she had Hashimoto. She just couldn't really get it under control. She'd made some dietary changes. There are some obvious things you might do, like remove gluten. We know gluten's a big issue in Hashimoto's. She had already done a lot of research. She'd upped her vitamin D levels and, changed her diet, and it looked pretty clean, actually. And I just thought, okay, where are we going to go with this? And then when I found out she had a glutathione missing gene, I thought, okay, this makes a lot of sense, because glutathione is crucial for the removal of mercury from the body, as you know. And so I thought, I'm going to really zoom in on detoxification support, really make sure that we kind of drag the mercury out of the body, support glutathione production. So I gave her quite a high potency form of milk thistle, which a lot of people will know is a great way of boosting glutathione, and gave us some other little bits and bobs to kind of support this. And the results were amazing. I mean, absolutely amazing. And we were doing a regular blood test for her thyroid, and we watching the antibody levels just come down over the next few months as her body's, the immune system was just calming and stopping that constant attack on the thyroid. And that was a good way of, for me, how, I learned a lot from that, because it guided me, but also that's how, in some cases, it does point you in certain directions, and it does give you that better understanding of the individual, because otherwise it's hard to know. Yeah,
it's like, where are the weaker points? And I always see over and over again that when people are under pressure, we're all under different pressures, but even with aging, the points that give way are always your genetic vulnerable points. They're the parts that are going to let you down. Something's going to get all of us in the end, but we want to delay that as long as possible. So knowing where your vulnerable points are means that you can be proactive and support them. And even, again, I think people think, eating organic, is it really worth it? do I need to spend extra money on that? And all those kind of concerns. But actually, if people know that they've got particular vulnerabilities in terms of detoxification of those chemicals, then it might persuade them to try it and to work through that and just to develop those habits for life.
Yeah, I agree. And on a slightly off topic, but kind of related, is there a gene that's that you can get a variant on where people maybe struggle more with barbecued food and may struggle to sort of detoxify the compounds you make from barbecued food? I thought this is an interesting one.
Yeah, that's a really, really good one, actually. So anything that produces smoke is detoxified. First of all, you know, when we talked about alcohol having 2 steps.
Yeah.
So there is a phase 1 step that almost draws that smoke into the system more efficiently. So anything that is smoked, whether it's barbecues, whether it's exhaust fumes, whether it's anything that's combusted, basically some people really, really are more vulnerable to that sort of pollutant.
Right. And so if you've got this variant, basically you sort of have to say, look, for you, this type of food production is an issue. You know, barbecuing for you is a real problem.
Yeah, and it might be that they can have a barbecue occasionally, but if they live in a culture or a country where that's really, really, you know, prevalent and people are barbecuing every night or every other night because the weather's good,
of course,
then it might actually be a really bad thing for that individual. So yeah, so we can help it again with cruciferous vegetables are really good. I think there's also a set of foods that actually slow down that absorption as well and almost hit it early on.
Right.
Which whenever we look at these processes, we're trying to work out where we can intervene soonest before it even causes any damage.
Makes sense.
And herbaceous vegetables, which I think are things like carrots and apples, actually help to push that back and stop it even getting into your system.
That's great. So a bit like the alcohol, again, you can kind of buffer some of the effects of that. Yeah. Okay. And another thing I wanted to ask you about as well was gluten. Are there any kind of gene variants with gluten that are of any significance?
Yeah. So there are some genes called HLA, which are part of our immune system. And what they do is control the surveillance, really. So it works out what is an enemy, what isn't an enemy. And unfortunately, some people have a version of those genes that it's almost as if they're a little bit hard of seeing and they just get it wrong. So they're more likely to mix up a protein in gluten, gliadin, with the body's own tissues. And that means that they attack everything around it. So again, if you know that you have that risk, it doesn't mean that it's definitely going to happen. It just means that it's a higher risk for you. It can be used actually more as a way of ruling out gluten intolerance or celiac disease. Yeah. And that can be really useful because if you suspect someone has this adverse response to gluten, the autoimmune aspect of it, then it can actually be really difficult to test. Yeah. Because you've got to eat the gluten.
I always think this is awful.
Yeah.
I always say, I actually do say to patients, look, you know, it is clearly causing huge amounts of inflammation. You literally are off work for a week. Why would we want to put you through it just for the sake of testing it? So that's a really good point. And I hadn't thought of that you could test the genetics just to even rule it in or rule it out.
Yeah. And if you rule it out, for example, then you know that's not a thing.
Yeah.
It's something else that's playing in.
Yeah, it's an allergy or a sensitivity or something else. Yeah.
So again, you know, functional testing, a blood test might be good for some circumstances and a gene test might be good for others. Or sometimes the combination is the most powerful thing.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think that's good to highlight that genetic testing, we call this functional testing, don't we, in terms of the more advanced comprehensive tests that you basically wouldn't get from conventional medicine.
Yeah.
There's lots of different types of it, and they kind of weave in between each other, and sometimes there are certain tests that become more relevant. Sometimes you may not, need to do any tests at all, but it's nice to know that. I mean, we have a lecture in our final year of nutrition, as you know, because I know you've taught on it, where we kind of introduce students to all the different types of testing, because sometimes in clinic you think, I need to do a stool test, I need to know in detail what's going on with the gut, or you may say, I need to look at the hormones, so you may look at a hormone panel, or let's look at the genetics. There's obviously all these different tests, and it's, you kind of learn as you go, don't you, what test is being implicated here.
Yeah, and some things are really hard to test for, like they're so transient. So when you're doing a blood test, that depending what you're testing, that chemical could be there 1 minute and gone another minute, or certainly week to week or month to month. So a genetic test actually is a very factual thing. So it's giving you some information that is almost like your baseline. It's like, this is my foundation, this is what I'm working above.
100%. The other area that I think is very common, and obviously you'll know much better than me, is with nutrigenomics, is looking at sex hormone pathways. So obviously our sex hormones, for example, if we pick the two big ones, testosterone and estrogen, although we won't go into this in much detail because it is a complex area, this is another great area of testing because, of course, these hormones have various effects on the body. And so often in clinic, we are presented with imbalances in the sex hormones, whether it be, too much estrogen. I mean, estrogen, there's many types. So maybe the more potent, harmful type is kind of the dominant one, which is a problem. There's all sorts of things that could go wrong. But this is also where it just guides you a bit more. And you might look at somebody that maybe has, a higher risk of breast cancer, or wants to, maybe has a family history, and they're thinking, how can I do everything to understand my body, reduce my risk? And by looking at the genetics, you can see, like you said, where are my strengths breaking down, or these sex hormones, where are my weaknesses, and therefore what do I need to do to support them? Yeah,
that's a really good example actually. So if we just think about estrogen, the usual scenario is that there's too much of it, and especially in combination with environmental estrogens. So we've got estrogens that are made by the body, and then we've got estrogens that are in plastics and pill receipts and things like that. So all stacked up, again, in today's world, probably more than we would have historically been exposed to. And some people have got variances on genes that detoxify that estrogen, and some people have got the slow version, and some people have got the more efficient, faster version. So if you know that you've got the slow version, then actually it all comes back to that conversation about methylfolate.
Right.
Because you need the methyl part to help the detoxification of the estrogen.
Right.
And so for some people, that's a real area of focus.
Interesting.
But then, like you said, it might be that it's a different form of estrogen that one person has got more of, and it might not be the most healthy thing to have. Yeah,
I think that's a big, this is, as I'm sure you do see this all the time, because there are three main kind of forms of estrogen, and one of them is quite pro-cancerous actually. So if you're really dominant down that particular route and your body's pushing it all in that funnel, then that could be a problem, again, in the wrong environment. But people don't know what's going on. People don't know this. And this is where the testing comes in to kind of guide you as to where do we sit here. And if you are down that more dominant route, it doesn't just present as breast cancer. It could present as really bad painful periods, or fibroids, or endometriosis, or the list goes on and on and on. Absolutely. So again, it's very practical, very real. Sorry, Emma.
And we're trying to steer that estrogen down the good paths.
Yes.
That's the thing. It's almost like there are forks in the road, and we want most of it to go down here and do the good stuff. But some people's genes, or they're like signal points on a train track. They're pointing it down this way. So it's how do we turn it around and persuade it to go down the healthy route?
Definitely. And then we come back to our cruciferous vegetables, you know, broccoli sprouts being a great way of helping with this.
Yes.
And again, coming back to that really key gene where we activate folate. So we go right back there. So hopefully people listening can start to see how, from our perspective as practitioners, we would very much look at this as a whole picture.
Yeah.
And we're not trying to isolate one part of the body. You know, this is not in any way to criticize conventional medicine, but one of the challenges I find with conventional medicine is that you are categorized. You know, you go in with period pains, you see a gynecologist who's only interested in that particular part of your body. And then if you have any diarrhea, you're off to the gastroenterologist, and then you go off to so-and-so. Obviously, we're trying to do the opposite. We're trying to see the whole person, and we're trying to personalize it, right? I guess this comes back to the exact purpose of this podcast.
Absolutely. And it's the connectivity between all these things that the genes can help with. So the vitamin D example is a perfect one. We know about all the functions of vitamin D on mood, on bone health, on immunity, etc. But just one SNP, one variance on that gene can create all those different symptoms. So imagine someone goes to a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist for the mood. They go to an immunologist for their immunity, and they go to an endocrinologist or a bone person for their osteoporosis. And none of those people are going to necessarily join it up and make the connection that it's this thing.
Yeah.
But we can.
Exactly. We're in a really good position to be able to do that. And that's why I love what I do. I love the problem solving. I love the connecting the dots. And yeah, very fortunate to be able to do that. So my last question for you, Emma, what's your favorite gene variant? Putting you on the spot.
So personally, for me, I have experienced anxiety forever. Like, I was the kid in the class who knew the answer to the question but didn't want to put my hand up, because if I did, the attention would be on me and I'd be blushing and nervous and all of that. And I discovered that I have a problem with vitamin B6. So I actually break down B6 more quickly than most people. And that means that I don't make the calming neurotransmitter called GABA, but I basically don't make the anti-anxiety chemicals as efficiently. And so when I learned that, it was transformational. Like, I literally, before that, would not have been able to sit here without shaking.
Wow.
Just to do this.
Yeah.
So you can imagine the life-changing.
I can see why it's your favourite variant now.
So I love B6.
I love B6 too. It's a great vitamin supplement, of course. That's a great way to finish the podcast. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you, talking about all things genetics. And I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you for your great hosting.
No problem. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss a future episode.